pleased to present today's event in collaboration with the British Consulate-General and Vancouver Economic Commission. The Catalyst Business Alliance is a network of Canadian companies working together to champion strong climate and energy policy and the creation of a resilient economy. To learn more about Catalyst, please visit our website, catalystbc.org. The Pembina Institute, for those of you who don't know us, is Canada's leading climate and energy think tank. We work together with governments, industries, and communities to advance a prosperous, clean energy future. On behalf of the Pembina Institute, I'd like to thank the Real Estate Foundation of BC, the Sitka Foundation, and the North Family Foundation for their generous support of our work. If you'd like to support our work in this important area, please get in touch with us at pembina.org. A few housekeeping items for this event. All participants will be muted during the webinar. And please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on Pembina Institute's website. To kick us off this morning, I'd like to introduce you to Nicole Davison, Consulate-General for the British Consulate-General here in Vancouver, to give us an overview of the UN Climate Change Conference, also known as COP, standing for Conference of the Parties, and to tell us why this year's COP, the 26th gathering, is particularly significant, and what the UK and Italy hope to achieve in hosting this year's COP. Over to you, Nicole.
Great, thank you. I was having a bit of a mute button battle. But anyway, thank you so much, Karen. And a huge thank you to you and to Pembina for organising today's event. It's really fantastic the way we've managed to make this conversation really collaborative on the ground. And so thank you for all your support that you've shown over the last few months and as we continue through to COP26. As Karen mentioned, I really wanted to talk a little bit about why this COP matters so much and what our level of ambition is, and to kind of put it sort of at this point in time. So as you know, we're hosting COP26 in just over 2 weeks' time. And I'm quite often asked about the UK's level of ambition for COP. And it is definitely true that we have a very high level of ambition, but I would like to say it's not just the UK's ambition, it's got to be our global ambition as well. And the UK as chair has a certain leading role in that, but it's really a point in time for us all to come together. And so the ambition doesn't obviously solely rest with us. As you know, the Paris Agreement in 2015 was a landmark COP in that for the first time in decades, it actually set binding agreements bringing us together in a common cause as regards climate change. But it was really only the beginning of the road. And we've been on that journey ever since. And I think some of the COPs that we've seen in recent years have kind of fallen short on ambition and delivery. So this really represents a moment in time for us to kind of really take another look at ambition and set out what needs to be done. And I think, if anything, if Paris was about aspiration and ambition, this COP has got to be about delivery. And that has got to be a really strong focus of it. Despite where we were in 2015 with Paris, since then emissions have still continued to rise. Recently, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a code red for climate. And in short, if we don't act immediately, the 1.5 degree limit is going to slip out of reach. So there is absolutely no turning back from this point. So the pressure really is on. In terms of COP and the objectives that the UK has set for it, we're asking countries to deliver on 4 key goals. That is about emissions reductions, so that's about securing global net zero by 2050 and keeping 1.5 degrees within reach. And in essence, what that means is accelerating the phase out of coal, curtailing deforestation, speeding up the switch to electric vehicles, and encouraging investment in renewables. And that sustainability finance piece really is key and is also a through theme of COP this year. Our second ambition is around adaptation to protect communities and natural habitats. And that is about protecting and restoring ecosystems. And it is also about building defences, warning systems and resilient infrastructure and agriculture to avoid the loss of homes, livelihoods and lives. So very key elements of that. Mobilizing finance is our third ambition, our third goal, and that comes us back to the sustainable finance question, but it's about delivering really finding the finance and securing the finance to deliver on the first two goals that I mentioned, and about developing countries who have to make good on their promise to mobilize at least $100 billion in climate change every year, and accessing wealth and accessing funding from the richest countries, the richest individuals to really fund climate change. And I don't want to get sort of overtly controversial political, but I heard Prince William on the radio this morning basically talking about space tourism and saying, the richest individuals in the world should really focus on what we need to do to make this planet better rather than finding a new planet to live on. So just throwing that out there. On mobilizing finance as well, it's about international financial institutions who have to play their part and working together towards unleashing trillions in private and public sector's finance, which is what we need to secure global net zero. And then the final objective is around working together, which basically includes all of us coming together to make the negotiations in Glasgow a success. It's about finalizing the Paris rule book. So in essence, implementing the detailed rules that made Paris Agreement operational, and it's about accelerating action to tackle the climate crisis through collaboration with businesses, governments, civil society, and recognizing that things don't just sit at federal level, they sit at every single level. They sit at federal, provincial, municipal, business, university, civil society, individual. All that action has to come together. I just want to say a little bit about what's been happening in the last couple of years on the road to COP. So when the UK took on the COP presidency, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. That figure now stands at 75% and rising. And most recently, just a few weeks ago, within the last couple of weeks, both Turkey and the United Arab Emirates have declared net zero targets. And the UAE is actually quite significant, and that's the first Gulf country to do so. So obviously we're talking about heavy oil emitting countries. The UAE has now stepped up and also has a net zero target. But there are others that still need to follow. In short, we want to see the same level of ambition from the largest nations, from all G20 countries, because between us we cover about 80% of global emissions. So we really need to see that level of ambition rise even further beyond 75%. And in the past 2 years, more than 70 countries have come forward with updated and more ambitious 2030 NDCs, including Canada, who significantly stepped up their level of ambition as well. And that includes every G7 nation and some of the world's most climate vulnerable countries. So what we want this COP to be, I've talked about the high level of ambition, but we want this COP to be the COP that consigns coal power to history. We want it to be the COP which accelerates the drive to electric vehicles. We want it to be the COP that ends deforestation, and we want it to be the COP that reduces methane emissions, and we want it to be the COP where everybody takes ownership of this from every level to the highest to the lowest. And all of these opportunities are important in their own right, but they actually also represent growth opportunities. They represent growth, jobs opportunities and supply chain opportunities, and we have to see it in that economic context as well. So going back to the Paris Agreement, analysis suggests that the commitments made then would have capped the rise in temperature to below 4 degrees, but we now need to go much further to keep 1.5 degrees in reach. And for that reason, Glasgow is incredibly important. We have to see a negotiated outcome that launches a decade or even decades of ever increasing ambition. So as I said, we now need to move from ambition to delivery, and that's what we hope this COP will do. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, for providing some insights into COP. Certainly that feeling of there's no turning back based on a couple of recent international reports, and the fact that emissions continue to rise is top of mind, and also taking to heart and quite appropriate for this panel, the need to for all of us to work together, government at all levels, as well as business and civil society down to individuals. Before we switch to our panel, I'd like to do an audience poll and check in with the audience. We're curious to hear how you're feeling that the government is doing, government in Canada is doing on climate action. Do you think that we're global leaders and Canada is on track to meet climate targets, or that we have good policies in place but more needs to be done, that Canada is lagging behind and we're unlikely to meet targets, or we're a global embarrassment and are not going to be meeting targets? So we'll give it a minute for folks to put in your votes. All right, let's see how we're doing. Okay, well, nobody thinks that we're global leaders, and most people are thinking that we're lagging behind and unlikely to meet targets. Well, that is a little bit depressing going into COP, but hopefully we can turn things around. Okay, so now we're going to go on to a fireside chat with three speakers, and from companies who are very active in tracking global climate action and policies globally, but also locally. Following the fireside chat, we'll have time for panelists to answer your questions. So as questions are coming up for you, feel free to type them into your chat box at any time. And we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. So this morning's panel, I'm pleased to introduce John Dickerman from the Confederation of British Industries. John is based in Washington, D.C. and heads up operations in the Washington office and focuses on policy questions that involve U.S. government relations, including international trade, financial services, climate change, and energy. Prior to joining CBI, John worked as a legislative and policy advisor for 2 members of Congress. From HSBC, Dana Krhovich. Dana is a 15-year veteran of the sustainability field. Dana is joining us by phone today, so you won't see her video, but she is online. And she started as an ESG analyst in the fledgling ESG ratings industry. She worked at 2 leading environmental think tanks in the US and Canada, and then in provincial climate change policy and sustainability consulting before her current role at HSBC, where she's leading the bank's sustainable finance initiatives in Canada. From Mott MacDonald, Niniane Tozzi. Niniane currently leads Mott MacDonald Canada's sustainability and climate change business. She has worked with government, researchers, and private sector clients in the US, Canada, the UK, and beyond to lead initiatives and advise on cities, power, energy, resilience, and carbon management. And moderating today's discussion is Jeff Holmes from Carbon Engineering. Jeff has worked in direct air capture of carbon dioxide since 2008, both in the academic capacity and at Carbon Engineering. Jeff has worked on the development of technology itself and has published on air contactor design and cost assessment of direct air capture and fuel synthesis, and he now leads Carbon Engineering's regulatory and policy engagement. Jeff, over to you and our panelists.
Well, thank you, Karen. I'm pleased to be a part of this. Looking forward to having this discussion with our panel today. And Nicole, thank you for the level set in terms of where we're at and what we're going to try to accomplish at the COP coming up 2 weeks from now. That was very informative and appreciated. So look, to kick us off, I'm curious what our panelists think about what's been said so far. We'd like to hear from each of these companies, if we may, that while COP is fundamentally a negotiation between countries on how countries are going to get their emissions down, why do we care about it as businesses and frankly as employees and citizens as well? So what's important about COP for us and what's important about this year's COP? Niniane, if you don't mind, we'd like to start with you.
Sure thing. Thanks so much. Good morning, everyone. Big thanks to Pembina for organizing. Really glad to kind of be on the panel and talking with you all today. So I thought what I might do is, before going into the nuances of kind of why COP matters for us at Mott MacDonald, I think there's kind of a bigger, more sort of global reason why COP should matter for all of us, and it's really the IPCC report that was released earlier this year that Nicole alluded to earlier. So the IPCC, basically, for folks that don't know, stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the report that was released this year is the 6th report. So the premise really of these reports is it gives kind of a status update on where our climate is today, gives a bit of forecasting on kind of the future, where we're going, where we're going, and really it incorporates kind of the latest and greatest data on all of that, essentially. So Again, this came out earlier this year, and you know, essentially, so it's a 3,500 page document. You know, go ahead and read it if you like, but there's certainly a couple of highlights that stick out from all of that. The first is really that the climate is warming. We've known this for a while, but now we only know this with more certainty. And you know, we've been talking about kind of the 1.5 and 2 degree 2-degree warming. You know, the report kind of lays out how we could easily get to 3 degrees if we don't kind of act and do something. So with the climate warming, it's also now unequivocally clear that, you know, human activities have led to this warming, and it's specifically related to emissions. And so a key thing in terms of action is like we really need to do as much as we can, as soon as we can, to kind of reduce our emissions. And then maybe kind of the last point that I would highlight is that, you know, we have seen some changes have gone on our Earth and planet that are unchangeable at this point. So things like sea level rise and ice cap melting. And so, you know, these are what you'll see on the screen there is just kind of some snippets of kind of what I just mentioned. But, you know, the kind of high level takeaway from this report is that our situation is quite serious. We are certainly in a climate emergency globally. So nowhere, you know, nowhere on our planet really is not being affected by this. And so if I could just go to the next slide, because I just want to contextualize this for Canada. What this really, you know, what this means for Canada, and honestly, I suspect a lot of us probably felt this summer, is, you know, just because of where we sit geographically in the world, like the warming climate is just affecting us at a quicker rate. So we have, you know, higher extremes, higher temperature, less precipitation. So it really, the situation is quite serious, right? And so the reason why this is really related to COP is because COP is really intended to kind of address the challenge of climate change. And so you know, taking this kind of a step back into kind of what it means for Mott MacDonald. So, you know, we are traditionally kind of like an engineering and infrastructure firm. So we work in the natural and built environment. So we do everything from actually kind of building roads and bridges to also a lot of advising of sort of systems and governments and municipalities and things of that nature. And so you know, for us, climate change is something that we have kind of codified into kind of our culture at this point. So we have made a, you know, commitment to be net zero by 2050. We have signed up to the UN Global Compact. So it's something that we kind of embed in the culture of our business. But the type of work that we do also is really directly related to climate mitigation adaptation. So we do everything from you know, making the built environment more resilient to kind of these climate extremes that we're now experiencing, as well as we do a lot of work of mitigation in terms of like carbon management, carbon sequestration, things kind of that nature. So I guess I'll just, you know, in sum, I think, you know, COP matters to us not just because kind of we work in the space, but it matters to us because, you know, we're a 17,000 kind of person company. We live in the communities and the environments that we work in, and it's really kind of, you know, COP is the ultimate kind of climate conference that the decisions that come out of this will really affect all of us, and certainly our business in a myriad of ways. Thank you.
Niniane, thank you. Dana, I know we've got you on the line, though we can't see you on video today. We heard from Nicole that there's 4 key goals for the UK and heading into this conference: GHG reductions, adaptation, the mobilization of finance, and working together. So from your perspective and from that of somebody who works at HSBC, why is this COP important to you? And do any of these key goals articulated by Nicole speak to you and to your work? Dana, we can't hear you yet if you're still there. So John, if you don't mind, let me maybe pitch the same question to you. And Dana, if you're still on the line, give us a quick hello at some point, and I'll send the next question your way.
Sure, absolutely, Jeff. Look, first of all, I just want to take a moment to say how pleased I am to be here today. Thank you very much to Pembina for inviting me. It's a privilege to be able to work with you and the excellent panelists that you brought together. And many thanks, of course, also to those of you who are tuning into our discussion. I do hope you find it useful. Look, from my perspective, I can give you a 35,000-foot answer in one sentence. COP is an opportunity for us to highlight business's role in combating global climate change and to showcase the investment and innovation of our businesses and outline how companies can work with international governments to make a difference. How are we going to do that? Well, look, I represent a business trade association in the UK. The CBI is the UK's largest business trade association. We represent about 1/3 of the private sector in the UK, and our membership is incredibly diverse. We represent industries and businesses of every scale and across all sectors. It's not often when you work for a business trade association like I do that I find myself sitting there and shaking my head and agreeing with everything that somebody from government has said. But that's exactly the position I was when Nicole was talking about what the priorities are going to be for COP or the UK government. I think it's an opportunity for convergence more than anything else, right? It's an opportunity for business and government to come together and highlight the areas that we need to highlight in order to ensure that we're going to have a sustainable future. So from a business perspective, the CBI has 4 key aims for COP. We want to build global consensus. We want to see increased collaboration from government and business on climate change and nature. We want to inspire a race to the top. We want to highlight the good work done by business to decarbonize in an effort to challenge others on their journey to net zero, other businesses. We want to drive real policy outcomes. We want to ensure that the UK government knows the views and challenges of business when it comes to delivering and achieving net zero ambitions. Indeed, we want to ensure that the global governments understand that. And fourth, we want to create a legacy of action. It's our ambition to embrace the outcomes of the summit, but also to identify any gaps in progress and continue to campaign on those issues because they're going to be essential to business going forward. So from my perspective, from our perspective as an organization, and certainly from our member perspective, COP is an opportunity for us to bring together all of those issues, to converge on them, but also to really push the policy areas that need to be pushed going forward and to embrace them. I think it's an opportunity for business and government really to converge in ways that perhaps they haven't had in the past.
John, thanks for that. Hey, if I can key in on one or two of the remarks you made there, you mentioned both business leadership and a race to the top, and you also mentioned policy outcomes. Could you say a little more on the kind of activities that businesses and corporates are taking on voluntarily, the kind of activities that would be either mandated or incentivized by policy, and if there's connections between the two, or are these two separate worlds?
Yeah, I think there are connections. I mean, the one area that I would highlight consistently is the opportunity in sustainable finance. By investing sustainably, we can create whole economies that are useful in the process of economic recovery and decarbonization. But we recently produced a paper called "Financing the Transition to a Sustainable Future." The CBI did. I'm happy to provide a copy of that to anybody who'd like to see it. But it provides policy recommendations on what's needed to unleash the capital for decarbonization. But also improved biodiversity and tackling social issues, which are equally important. In it, we suggest business needs a regulatory and policy framework with a real solid set of principles focused on the transition process. And we've recommended that government look at that and given them 8 principles that we think are important. First, supporting the whole domestic economy transition with effective sectoral plans and mechanisms that can unlock critical sustainable finance flows. Secondly, ensuring appropriate policy frameworks and unambiguous regulation to allow the financial services sector to drive the growth of sustainable finance. And third, to promote international convergence and sustainability and reporting standards, scale up investment beyond the UK's borders, and to ensure a smooth and global transition. So I think, for us, it's about establishing an appropriate regulatory framework, but also more than that, I think establishing partnerships. And that's something that we talk about in finance constantly. Where are the opportunities for government and business to converge when it comes to really investing in the infrastructure that we need, investing in the opportunities that we need to grow our economies. I think from a business perspective, we'd say public-private partnerships are hugely important. We need to work together in these areas, because if we don't, then we're butting heads, and that's not useful for anybody.
So Niniane, that sounds like some of the work that you and the team at Mott MacDonald do. If you're building bridges and roads and other infrastructure, we know we have to tackle the energy system. We've got to get sort of a clean 21st century energy system in place. We still have to move people and goods and information around the way we do today in a world where environments and regions are changing due to the climate. How does this tie into your perspectives at Mott?
Yeah, for sure. So, it's interesting. I mean, so we're a global company, so we do work really kind of, everywhere. And it's interesting how this question is answered in different parts of the world, right? So from a North American perspective, there's a lot, there is legislation and regulation that gets kind of folded into projects that kind of have to kind of exist and go forth. But there has been certainly, I've noticed in the last sort of year or two, a significant push in kind of this ESG space. So for us, it's anything from like, so I should say like ESG stands for environment, social, and governance outcomes. And so, that is the buzzword. Sustainability is the buzzword. Like a lot of these terms actually translate and can mean sort of very similar things. But the bottom line is that these outcomes and these metrics are becoming increasingly important to our clients, either because of kind of regulatory pushes that they need to care about this stuff. And when I say this stuff, I mean carbon impacts, resilience considerations, adaptation consideration, infrastructure. And then the flip side is that a lot of our clients also are doing this because they kind of see the writing on the wall and kind of what's coming down the line. And it's like, even if they're not regulated into this, they realize that it is something that they need to work into their planning and their decision making, because it makes business sense, which I do think has been quite kind of the shift in the last couple of years, is that now this whole conversation around ESG impacts and sustainability and climate considerations, it does not make business sense if you are not kind of factoring this, right? And so there's a variety of ways that kind of goes on. It's anything from considering kind of standards and frameworks that exist to inform decision making for the way that infrastructure is developed. But just to touch on the point of financing, I mean, talk about that being kind of another sort of buzz term in the whole conversation now. So an example of this is in the lead up to COP, we and a whole host of other partners, including HSBC and governments in Europe, are involved in something called the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. And essentially what CCRI is looking to do is that they're looking to establish a methodology that informs investment, financial investments decisions with sort of physical climate risk. So the idea is that a methodology or a process is like they're trying to develop this way to really kind of embed climate risks in decision making for financing. And so there's a whole host of stuff that is happening, that just being one example, and I could list a myriad of others that we kind of use in kind of the infrastructure space. And again, it kind of runs a gamut from standards to kind of working groups like I just mentioned.
Thanks, Niniane. Now, Dana, do we have you on the line at this point? Still can't hear you. Let's give you one more second. Okay, so our apologies, folks. I think Dana had some IT issues today. She tried to dial in, but that doesn't seem to be working either. So look, I'll take moderator's privilege for a moment and just sort of tell a quick anecdote from my company as well, and why COP is important for us. So I work for Carbon Engineering, and we've been designing and developing technologies since 2009 that absorb CO2 directly out of atmospheric air. And that CO2 can be stored underground to create what we call negative emissions or carbon removal that helps counteract some of the emissions that are costly or challenging to deal with today, or atmospheric CO2 can also be combined with renewable energy to directly make fuels that can substitute crude oil for the energy that powers transportation. So our belief is that when deployed alongside renewables and energy efficiency and the many other changes we have to make, direct air capture is going to help us get to our climate targets more economically and quicker than without. The fact is these projects need to roll out at immense industrial scale. They need to be financed and executed at sort of billion-dollar scale per project. And that, of course, doesn't happen unless there's an economic return. So when the countries get together and negotiate targets at COP, what often happens is that national level governments or subnational governments in the form of provinces and states and others then try to put policy frameworks into place to achieve the targets that have been agreed upon at COP. We see this in Canada in the form of our climate plan formulation over the last couple of years, in the policy implementation in carbon pricing, in the clean fuels regulation, and other measures announced this year. We see it in the United States with a very big infrastructure package in front of Congress right now that would direct very substantial funding into renewables, EVs, carbon capture and storage, carbon removal, and we see it in the EU with their climate law, their Fit for 55 package, and the continued policy making that happens there. So to make a long story short, from my perspective as somebody who works at Carbon Engineering and somebody who develops climate relevant technology as a day job, the COP process is in some way the top level of setting the market and expanding the market for these solutions. And then that market gets created and the rubber meets the road when nations do their policy making and enact laws and regulations. So it's immensely important. So I'd like to move us along a little bit to another question that we'd like to pose to the panel here. We saw in our poll, our audience today doesn't think we're on track to meet our targets. It's what the IPCC report that Niniane mentioned says as well. We're on too slow of a pace to realize 1.5 degrees. So I'd like to get some reflection from Niniane and then John about what role businesses have to help us meet this target and accelerate decarbonization, and what more do we need to get this translated into action that businesses and local levels can take?
Yeah, sure thing. So, I think, the short answer is that, businesses have a central role to play, primarily because, businesses include people that are members of communities. And so, as working from the private sector, like I often kind of meet this, cataclysmic divide between the private sector and government. And the reality is especially when considering kind of the climate emergency, there is no discrimination in terms of who gets affected. We're all impacted kind of by the current situation. But I think for us as Mott MacDonald, we kind of look at this in two kind of key ways, right? So number one, I mentioned earlier that we're 17,000 people. That means that we can create education and culture for 17,000 people that live in communities that then go out and live in those communities. And so we very much take that cultural aspect of our company and what we push as sort of sustainability and climate change sort of messaging is very quite serious. And again, just for that human side. The second obvious aspect for us as an infrastructure business is, we are intrinsically involved in the natural and built environment, right? So we, to put it bluntly, we are part of, the whole spectrum of kind of the problem and the solution, right? So, and when I say problem, it's really, we really kind of see it as an opportunity for, how do we build better and smarter? And that's a really, really sort of key thing, right? And so we consider things like, the, embodied carbon, for example, on projects, but then circularity, like circular economy is like a hugely important aspect of what we do as well, right? Because at the end of the day, when if a bridge or a road or a tunnel does actually need to be built, for a myriad of just sort of planning and necessary reasons, then how can you just sort of build that better and take all of this consideration into play? And so yeah, so that's I guess what I would say is our why it really matters to us is and I guess I'll just mention one more point on this. I mean, we also really do see ourselves, and I think the business community in general, like we have a lot of room to innovate, and obviously carbon engineering is an amazing example of innovation, right? And so the issue of climate change is really gonna take, it's every tool in the toolbox, right? So it's doing less, it's emitting less into the atmosphere, but it's also kind of innovating and figuring out better ways to kind of build the infrastructure that we need to build.
Thanks, Niniane. John, sort of same question to you. We're moving too slowly. How can business help us speed up? How can business help us get on track to a 1.5 degree scenario?
Look, I think the simple answer from my perspective is transparency. I think we need to take the conversations that are happening in the boardroom, and we need to deliver those and disseminate those to consumers and to voters. And that's an interesting issue. I understand, but I think climate change is in the public's conscience now in a way that it probably never has been before. I started at the CBI in 2012, and I often kind of considered Washington D.C. at that time to be a climate change desert. Probably more a comment on what U.S. policy was like in 2012 than what global policy was like. But it was hard to have a discussion about climate change from a business perspective, looking to influence government. That's changed completely now, and I think we have COP in Paris to thank for that. It's really brought the immediacy of the concern into the public dialogue in a way that it I don't think ever has been before. So it's an issue that voters care about, but it's also an issue that our customers and consumers care about too. So I think transparency about what business is looking to do and what they need to do in order to partner with government to make a difference is incredibly important.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I'll offer a quick comment as well. So obviously I work in the carbon removal field. One of the things we're seeing these days is a number of corporate actors voluntarily starting to purchase carbon removal. So there's a number that are notable: Microsoft, Stripe, Shopify. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few others, so I apologize to them. But the theme of some of these commitments is now that companies are pledging to go carbon neutral, and even in some cases pledging to go back and remove from the atmosphere the carbon that they have emitted over their lifetimes. That's what Microsoft has said. So we're actually starting to see real commitments from companies and credit-worthy contracts to buy carbon removal, which is of course very helpful to companies in our field who can go out and, along with participation in markets that are regulated or obligated by government action, actually finance off of these voluntary purchase agreements from corporate actors. So I think, to draw a lesson from that example, corporate action can kind of move faster, if not as thoroughly and comprehensively as regulated action from the government. So quite often I think corporates can lead where laws and regulations and more thorough established markets can follow. So we're getting a few questions through the chat box here. I've got two that almost look like a pair to me in terms of upwards influence and downwards influence. One is, how can companies encourage governments to make this COP the success we need to be? And the other is, what kind of policies or regulations could we imagine coming out of this COP? So, how can we influence the project and the process and make it a success? And then how in turn is the COP process going to influence our business environment? So I'll put those out for our two panelists and myself to discuss. And if either of you would like to comment on them, please do.
Yeah,
Matt,
sure. I can take are you sure, John, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, no, please.
Okay, thanks. So I'll take a stab at kind of that first question, which was around kind of how, if I understood it correctly, kind of how to help government, how can businesses help government, right, sort of achieve essentially. And I think we have a tremendous role to play here. I think this is to be honest, like one of the more exciting parts of COP, and a part that I'm personally very optimistic about, because I think back to my earlier comment around innovation, governments essentially are going to COP and they're going to make their commitments or NDCs, and they're going to say, okay, we're going to, commit to reducing emissions by this amount by this year. And I do think, and I say this as a policy person, that is my background, that's where most of my career has actually been in the public sector. I do think that oftentimes the ball can get dropped from the kind of the government and legislative side in terms of like how to achieve said target or goals. And I think that's where really the business sector, and not just the business sector, I think this is also a great civil society, non-governmentals, like we can play a really big role in figuring out and identifying ways to achieve these reductions and to achieve adaptation solutions. And so to me, that's that's a big, that's a really big part of it. And even as a company, I mean, we are going to, we're very much going to be present at COP, and globally, internally for Mott's, like that is just one of our big purposes for COP, is really to try and like not only show our own innovation, but really get in the room with other groups, other companies, other governments to kind of drive this innovation forward. And I guess I'll just say, like, I think one of the reasons why I'm also really hopeful about this is because I think if there's anything that positive that I think that this 2 years of pandemic has shown us, is that science and innovation has really gone leaps and bounds in kind of addressing, finding solutions in a manner that, in a much more timely manner than I think we could have imagined 10 years ago. And so I'm really hoping that we can pull that through for COP as well.
Niniane, thank you. John?
I couldn't agree more with that last point. And also, I think one of the things that these 2 years have shown us is that the world's actually a much smaller place than we thought it was, because we have the capacity to do events like this across time zones and across countries. I mean, I'm in Washington, D.C. right now. So, I think that's a fantastic point. Look, I think on the second question, Nicole hammered it when she gave her opening statement. I mean, what are some real clear outcomes that could happen? I think accelerating the phase out of coal is really important. Curtailing deforestation, really important. Speed up the switch to electric vehicles. Working to ensure that our supply chains aren't damaging the environments that we're living in, particularly important in food and beverage and hospitality industry. But I think what's really exciting about all of those things is that we should be thinking about them as opportunities for economic advancement and improvement. I mean, these are the jobs of the future. AI, climate change and green growth policy, investment in green energy. I mean, these are things that haven't been done substantively in the past, and nor have they been effectively regulated. We have an opportunity to work closely with government to figure out what the parameters should be or around those regulations, but also provide opportunities for our children and our children's children for jobs of the future. I mean, look at, I'm based in the US, but I represent the CBI North America. I mean, the US has 400,000 vacant manufacturing jobs right now. A lot of those are high-tech manufacturing jobs that they just have people, they can't find people who have the skills to do them right now. So we need to be working in conjunction also with our universities and our secondary schools and our primary schools to develop the workforce of the future that care about these issues. So it's an economic opportunity too.
I'll echo that, John. I think you know, very often governments get caught between the long-term policies that we know need to be put in place to tackle climate, and the near-term economic realities where you know, voters do want government to create jobs and create prosperity. So I'm with you on that, telling the opportunistic side of this story. You know, in our case, if we build a direct air capture plant, we create several thousand jobs while we engineer and construct that facility. There are several hundred that get maintained on an ongoing basis. The facility needs equipment and services, you know, very, very similar to the equipment that goes into today's energy sector and others. So there is very much a, you know, a stimulative effect and a prosperity effect here of tackling this challenge. And frankly, the world where we tackle it successfully is a lot better and more prosperous than the one where we don't. So look, we're down to our last couple minutes here, I think, as a panel, and then I have to take us into a quick poll and wrap up. But one last question for real quick reflection, if you have any. I've got a question here that boils down to the remark or the concept that private sector volunteerism to address the climate crisis will fail. While there's certainly a role for the private sector, the crisis requires urgent direction, action, and control from the public sector to avert the disaster. Can the panel comment? So quick remarks if you have any, and I'll take us to a poll.
Well, look, I think we have an equal role to play. I mean, there's an important thing to remember here. I mean, you know, we might be in the private sector and government might represent the public sector, but as Niniane really acutely put earlier on in her comments, we are all a part of the same community. And so I think it affects us equally. And the reality, of course, is, and from a business perspective, we don't want to turn a blind eye to opportunity either.
Yeah, so I think you know, I mentioned this earlier too, right? It's like I get it. It's like this sort of divide of like government and then everyone else, and private sector and everyone else. And I also mentioned earlier, like, okay, so the problem is, you know, the problem of climate change is impacting all of us, fine. But I also, I guess I would just really want to underscore that and maybe it's going to sound naive, but I really genuinely, I think that this cataclysmic divide, I think, is really seen as more of a divide in theory than it is in reality. And I'll give you a really good example from the infrastructure space. So, you know, a lot of work that we do actually involves, the majority of the work that we do in Canada involves public infrastructure. So the government, you know, puts out, you know, these calls for, you know, calls for work, calls for services to build a road, build a tunnel, you know, build, for example, another line out in Ontario, or the Broadway line here in Vancouver. And we are, you know, we then respond, the private sector responds and then delivers the work. And so the reality of the outcome is that, you know, this road or this piece of infrastructure, this park, this bridge, it's a government asset, but it's taken, you know, the private, the public, the you know, all sorts of like parts of kind of the economy and the sector to get stuff going and to get things built and to get things functioning. And so I guess what I would say is, like, one, the divide really isn't that great, but to also recognize the divide, you know, we have, I think, one opportunity here for us is, like, we do need to do a better job as a private sector to kind of have more open and honest conversations, you know, with government. And I don't want to go too into the weeds, but I'll just give one clear example of this, right? So in the engineering and consulting kind of space, you know, the general way that you win work is, you know, there's these closed bids. You respond, you provide a bid, you say how are you going to, you know, say how you're going to deliver X project, put a price tag on it, and then it goes. And generally speaking, I'm overgeneralizing, but honestly, generally speaking, we are still, you know, the industry is still very much in a world of, like, the lowest price wins. And unfortunately, with that, what the result of that is, you know, I think that sustainability and climate change impacts and really better or smarter projects aren't really at the forefront of that kind of planning when it comes to infrastructure. And so I think that, for example, is one opportunity where you know, I think government and the private sector, at least in my industry, can really come together to kind of figure out better ways and smarter ways of delivering this infrastructure. So I'll just leave it with that.
Niniane, thank you. I've got word that we can keep going on questions for a couple more minutes here, and I also happen to have a very specific one for you. Will the CCRI include emissions reductions and net zero as part of its core standards for the assessment of the benefits and approaches to climate resilient investments?
Yeah, so you know, so the process as it currently stands is really focused on adaptation. And so I know that where kind of the whole kind of project stands right now is that a methodology, like, so the partners, including again us and a whole bunch of other folks, including actually the HSBC Arab government, where the process currently stands now is that there's been a big effort to essentially insert climate risk data. So the real emphasis there is is wanting to focus on kind of the science behind climate risk, and really the exercise has been to kind of try to translate that to investment models, which, as I understand, has been kind of quite a challenge, but a method sort of exists. Again, the focus has been really resilience, and I think the next phase, so my understanding is that this testing is going on for this one sort of methodology, and the next phase is going to start to potentially consider mitigation, but that's still kind of TBD.
Thank you, helpful. John, I've got a question here for you from a concerned participant. You were talking about policies and regulations towards net zero. Do you anticipate these measures mentioned actually having teeth? And if so, is there the fear that this will just displace emissions intensive activities to countries that have not committed to similar packages?
Well, I think first of all, you know, we can't displace our responsibilities onto countries that are developing. And I think that those of us who represent business and those of us who represent business associations in the developed countries understand that, recognize that, and care about that. I think my response to that question would be, this really follows along the fourth point that I was making about what the CBI wants to achieve at COP, which is create a legacy of action. I mean, we want to be ambitious about how business can embrace the outcomes of the summit and keep government accountable for progress and issues that are essential to business, but also to the communities that we live in. So, I don't think I can answer comprehensively whether or not I think those regulations and policies are going to have teeth, because I don't want to speculate on that. I think business wants them to, absolutely. I think our communities want them to, and I think if we can keep business accountable or keep government accountable, then they will. But I also think that it's equally incumbent upon business to ensure that they lead from the front and not from the back. It's not one entity that has a majority of the responsibility here. It's got to be a cooperative effect, and I think that's why from the outset I said, and the CBI would argue, that this is an opportunity for business and government to converge and develop a real solid set of ideals that are going to carry us forward in a really positive way.
Okay, one last really quick one here. Let's do this as a lightning round. Predicting what one government is going to do is difficult. Predicting what many will do when put in the same room together is probably impossible, but I'm going to ask you to gaze into your COP crystal ball and tell me, are we going to see specific regulations or specific mandates come out of COP, such as carbon disclosure or carbon taxes? Do you have one prediction what we might see out of this COP? And I'll go after you. Niniane?
The short answer is yes, from my perspective. I think that by the end, on the last day of COP, are we going to have, carbon taxes in place? No, but I do think that in the next 6 months, the way that I just sort of see it is I think the NDCs are going to be committed to, those numbers are going to go out. And then in the next, like I said, I think 6 months to a year is really when I think you're going to start to see industry and then more local governments kind of respond in ways that do have teeth. That's my hope.
John?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, I think the pandemic gave government a perfect opportunity to slow walk commitments. They could have decided that it's too risky to send anybody to Glasgow and to this conference. But if you actually look at the delegations that people are sending, I think it's substantive. And I think that means there will be some real outcomes to this conference.
Okay, I'm gonna weigh in as well. I'm gonna be the skeptic just for fun. I don't think we're gonna see specific policy or regulation come out of COP. I think negotiations are gonna be super difficult. But I do think that simply by holding this COP and having all the countries show up, everybody's gonna need something to announce. Everybody wants to show progress in their country or in their region. Nobody wants to be the nation or the group that can't do something that others are doing. So by virtue of holding this COP, you're going to get tighter, nationally determined contributions. You're going to get bigger, faster pledges. And even in the absence of some giant breakthrough in negotiations and direct regulation or mandate coming out, you're still going to create sort of a positive accelerating effect in what the countries are doing. That's my guess for fun. So Niniane, thank you very much for participating in this. John, same to you. It's been a pleasure discussing this with both of you. Nicole, thanks for the level set at the beginning, and Karen, thank you for having all of us, and back over to you.
Yes, I'd like to echo thanks to all the speakers. Apologies we weren't able to patch in Dana. Huge thanks to Jeff for moderating and to Nicole for setting some context as well. And thanks to all of you for spending an hour with us. As a reminder, this webinar will be posted on Pembina's website. And if you're interested to learn more about Catalyst Business Alliance or Pembina Institute, please check out our websites. We look forward to all of you joining us next week for the last part of our series, which is on climate financing, supply chains, and risk management. So please remember to register if you haven't already. Thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.